Hi, folks. Welcome again to another episode of Pro Football in the 1970s. I'm your host, Joe Zagorski. Now, thanks to the Sports History Network, a signed copy of my new book, The 2003-Yard Odyssey, The Juice, The Electric Company, and an Epic Run for a Record, will be given away to one lucky fan. It's all about the 1973 Buffalo Bills. Please check out the Sports History Network online for details on how you can win a free copy of my new book on the 1973 Buffalo Bills. Thanks a lot for listening in to today's episode, folks. Look forward to chatting with you again soon in the future. Take care.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports, and welcome to another episode of the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. I'm Dan Newman, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Andrew Newman. Andrew, how are you doing today?
I am doing well, Dan. It was an eventful weekend. You were just recently up here in this very room over the weekend for my birthday / engagement festivities, but now we return to what's most important, which is old time sports and stadiums and baseball and things of that nature. And we put all personal things aside for the hour. So
yeah, Andrew, for the listeners, Andrew got engaged over the weekend, and his wife, his soon-to-be wife, and her family, who lives nearby, and my wife and I, and our parents who do not live all that nearby, we were all up there, and we surprised her, and then we all went out to a nice dinner afterwards. So by the time I get this edited and posted, Andrew might be married already, based on my speed of editing sometimes. But congratulations to Andrew, and I'm sure those things will come up quite a bit over the coming weeks when we do our little pre-episode banter, so to speak. But today we actually have a special show. We have a guest with us, and you may have heard him on a couple of other Sports History Network podcasts. He's here to talk about his book, Last Comiskey, and that is Ken Smoller, who is a photographer and writer based in Brookline, Massachusetts, with childhood roots in the Chicagoland area. He's photographed over 2,300 stadiums in 48 states and 24 countries. He runs the Stadium Vagabond blog at www.stadiumvagabond.com and social media at Stadium Vagabond. He is a Bostonian living with roots in another city, rooting passionately for other teams, and that's something that I can identify with well. So, Ken, thank you for joining us, and welcome to the Hello Old Sports podcast.
Thank you for having me. I now have Robert Redford's voice in my head saying hello, old sports, and I can't get out. I did want to talk all about wedding planning and everything and give you the advice that you probably shouldn't let your fiance hear that ballparks and stadiums are of slightly more importance. You are required to feign interest for the next, hopefully less than a year.
He's on the other side of the wall. It's fine.
My wife doesn't listen to me on podcasts, so
and mine does actually. I've been very lucky. Again, especially with a guest here, we don't want to digress too much, but I did think it was funny, and I'll just tell Andrew's story for him. He, in order to talk to the photographer a couple weeks ago, without his wife knowing because it was a surprise, Andrew told her that he had to go out in the car to talk to somebody to do a podcast interview that couldn't be done at any other time. So the podcast is a part of Andrew's wedding story already. So Ken, we were talking a little bit before we started recording. Andrew and I love all of this stuff. We love old stadiums. We love doing episodes about single year teams. We love sports documentaries, which for those of you who don't know, the book is based on a documentary of the same title. So why don't you just kind of tell us about the book, where it comes from, the genesis? Just give us the whole spiel.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, I'm from the Chicago area. I grew up in Arlington Heights, Illinois, which is a northwest suburb, which is of note because I grew up a Sox fan. And normally there's a geographic boundary, but for some reason, my dad, who grew up in the north side, became a Sox fan, and he passed that either joy or misery on to me. So I grew up a Sox fan. I started taking photographs of ballparks when I was about 11 years old. I think it was when the scoreboard had my birthday greeting from my parents on the scoreboard. I brought my little Kodak Instamatic 110 camera. It was also camera day, and you got to go down onto the field and take pictures of players like Greg Lazinski and, Carlton Fisk, Lamar Hoyt. And I just became hooked with bringing my camera to sporting events. Shortly thereafter, the Bears became a juggernaut, which is obviously distant history now, hopefully near future. I had the goal of trying to take a photograph of Walter Payton before he retired. And then we had Michael Jordan coming in the picture, followed by Frank Thomas. So I lived in a great city to learn how to photograph sports and how to photograph stadiums. I went on to college at the University of Michigan, got to cover the Fab Five during their freshman year, their march to the national championship, got to cover Desmond Howard during his Heisman Trophy year. And after college, I decided to get sort of a straight, legit job, become a lawyer, but continued to photograph on the side as much as I could. And little by little, it just became kind of a scavenger hunt. Every city I went to, I'd look for the stadiums. I'd find the university and photograph all the stadiums. And, obviously, like a lot of baseball fans, I wanted to get to every major league ballpark. I've now been to probably about 60, including former ones and temporary ones. And I've been to about 600 ballparks worldwide, minor league, college, Japanese, Italy, all kinds of random places, Mexico City. So that's kind of the background of what I do. I write and share my photographs on my blog and in social, which is really just sort of a long form travel writing, but with a real sports bent to it. And so that's what I'm doing. But my goal had been to do a book. And lo and behold, Matt Flesh, the documentarian, who's the first-time documentarian, put out a call on social media for photos and videos of old Comiskey Park. And sure enough, I had hundreds and hundreds that had been on old negatives that I had been in the process of restoring and scanning them in. And I contributed to the film for various background information during interviews and fades and things like that. But once the film came out and it got a great review, we were talking before, it was debuted in Chicago in May about a year ago, and then had a big showing at the Sabre conference in July. And at that time, I discussed with Matt, we could really take all the elements of the documentary and match photos with each part and then expand upon areas where he, maybe had to cut for time. Things like Turn Back the Clock Day or Michael Jordan's batting practice that year. And it came together pretty quickly. My photos, I had thousands from that year and maybe the last 10 years of Old Comiskey, I guess last 8 years, and ballparks from around, for comparison's sake. And it came together and we released it. We got Ozzie Guillen to provide a foreword to the book, which was a real thrill to get to chat with one of my childhood heroes and find out all of his thoughts about the ballpark and raising his kids at the ballpark. I used to watch his kids running around in the outfield with him and always be a little bit jealous. And I had some photos of them as kids doing that. And so it came together, and the book basically follows the 1990 season, which was a real surprise because the underdog White Sox challenged the heavily inflated and juicing Oakland Athletics. And they came within, a handful of games. They won 94 games that year before the wild card, so they didn't get to the playoffs. And it really brought the park to a close in a real celebratory fashion. So the book also features just all sorts of aspects of the ballpark itself, over 450 photographs of the ballpark and players that played there, and just kind of ties it together, that season along with the history of the ballpark.
And you make the point that this was a team that really sort of came out of nowhere. I just looked, and they had the second most wins in the American League. I think you said they had 90, and I think Boston had something like 88 to win the American League. And so, or the American League East, I should say. So this was one of those teams that had the season been, they were 94 wins.
94, 9 games back of Oakland.
And
how they finished.
And 6 better than the Red Sox. So
yeah,
sort of like the Giants in 93, some of these other teams, the Yankees, I think it was 86 where they were like, 97 win team or something. These are teams that they'd been playing under the 3 divisions, the wild card, let alone the current regime where half the league gets in the playoffs. These would have been considered powerhouse teams instead of sort of just being lost to history, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing about it is they were really well situated for the playoffs. They had a stellar relief corps with Bobby Thigpen getting 57 saves, breaking at the time Dennis Eckersley's record, and I think K-Rod broke that record 18 years later. They had a solid nucleus of young players. The scouting team did an amazing job, and they had 4 first-rounders in a row quickly ascend to the majors, starting with Jack McDowell, Robin Ventura, and then Frank Thomas and Alex Fernandez came up in August of that year at the same time. So that was the nucleus of a real strong team that had the strike not denied them in 94. They were going to potentially compete and go against the Expos in the World Series that year. That's what everyone kind of felt, because they went to the playoffs in 93 and got beat by a real strong Blue Jays team. But they were primed and ready to go in 94. And another aspect of them is lost to history.
People in New York disagree that it would have been the White Sox and the Expos in 94.
I know. The Yankees weren't ripe yet.
Yeah, and I actually agree with that. And as we do on this podcast, we get off the beaten path a little bit with things that everybody always says, oh, Yankees Expos 94, Yankees Expos 94. I sometimes have doubt that either team would have made it because the Expos were young. The Braves had been to 2 of the last 3 World Series. We've talked about this before a little bit, Andrew. I've always been skeptical that those would have been the World Series teams, but that's a conversation for another day. I'd also note that you brought up Jack McDowell. Yankee fans also have a different memory of him than maybe his years on the White Sox.
About it last week. We had a big book launch last week in Chicago at the Chicago History Museum, and Jack was one of our guests.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about the fact that White Sox fans, and frankly, a lot of baseball fans outside of New York or outside of Yankee Nation, love the fact that he had that moment where he flipped off the Yankee fans. And as he put it last week, they made me look bad in front of my old team. So,
that game was against the White Sox, wasn't it?
Yeah, I didn't realize that was the case until we brought it up. But man, Jack is still got a sharp wit to him. And it was such an honor having him last week join us. I had one of the coolest experiences seeing my 12 and 15-year-old kids chatting with Jack McDowell, learning about pitching. It was a real blast.
To kind of talk about the stadium for a moment, because I'm endlessly fascinated with stadiums. I'm actually wearing a Polo Grounds shirt right now at the moment from the New York Giants. And I don't know how much of it was it apparent at the time, they needed to replace Comiskey Park, or was it like, I remember when they got rid of the original Yankee Stadium there was talk of, well, no, you can't ever do it. It's historical. And then there were people being objective and saying like they've outgrown it. Was there a backlash to them building a new stadium? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It was Jerry Reinsdorf and Eddie Einhorn came in and bought the team in 1981 from Bill Veeck. And their statements from the start were about a need for a new stadium, a new shiny, fancy stadium like Royal Stadium, which was considered to be the gold standard at the time as a baseball-only facility. And it was built in 1910 by the same architect, Zachary Taylor Davis, that built Wrigley Field. Wrigley Field was built 4 years later, not actually called Wrigley, it was called Weedman Park for the Chicago Federal League Whales. But I digress a bit.
Excellent jerseys, by the way.
Yes, I do have a cool T-shirt of them. Not authentic and not vintage. But so Comiskey Park, from the very start, was not as in good of shape as Wrigley. And Reinsdorf spoke frequently about that we're not going to do what they did in New York and shut it down for 2 years and have the White Sox play in Wrigley or County Stadium. Mm-hmm. And that would, quote unquote, be a stupid waste of money, I believe was his phrase. Query whether or not it was not a stupid waste of money cheaping out on the ballpark that they built and having to put in a couple $100 million extra over the decades. We're moving 8 seats to the park, but we'll leave that for later. It was definitely 80 years old. It felt 80 years old. You had 80 years of beer stains and smells and hot dogs and onions and things like that. I consider that a feature more than a bug. I know a lot of White Sox fans that would have absolutely taken that bargain to go play in Wrigley for a year or two and have them do what they did in 1975 and 6. I guess it was 74 and 5 to Old Yankee Stadium. Mm-hmm. I would have taken that. I would have loved to have had those dimensions stay, those arches. One of the things that was really significant about Comiskey, like Tiger Stadium, it had twin decks encircling it. And that created an intimacy along with noise that's unlike almost any other ballpark. You could have 5,000-6,000 people, which was common in September and April games. And they would make a lot of noise just because the sound would be trapped. And you were on top of the field, similar to Yankee and Tiger and Wrigley and Fenway. But there was an elegance to the architecture. It was built by an architect who had really specialized in churches. And so there was an element to that, a reverence. It took into account the Chicago-style prairie architecture, and you would see very detailed brick patterns throughout the facade of the ballpark, which were, by the way, later whitewashed by Bill Veeck in 1960 to give it a bit more of a clean look. Mm-hmm. But as time went on, that paint would fade, and you can kind of get a better sense of what it looked like. But it also was based on the Roman Colosseum. I have a comparison of 2 photos in the book, actually 4 photos, showing the arches and the facade of the Colosseum, how they influenced the architect, Davis, in encircling the park with arches that allowed fans to see out to the streets and allowed the street life to see into the ballpark. And if you look at old baseball cards from, the 50s, 60s, 70s, very frequently, they were either photographed in New York or Chicago, because those were the teams that had both cities and big media markets. And you'll often see old baseball cards with Comiskey in the background, and you know it immediately from those arches. And it was special. That's where Babe Ruth played. That's where Jimmy Fox played. That's where Luke Appling, et cetera. And a lot of Sox fans did not want new. They wanted restoration. But that was... Reinsdorf was of the generation, get rid of old, get brand shiny and new. And it was before Camden by 1 year, and we can talk about that. White Sox fans now for 34 years have suffered with a ballpark that people will say, at best, it ain't that bad. You hear that phrase a lot, it's not that bad. But I would probably put it in the bottom, maybe 8 ballparks in the league right now.
Yeah, and you certainly
that's after the renovation.
You're certainly more qualified to speak on this, but both my brother and I are doing similar trips to the ones you mentioned, going to every major league park. I'm at about 20. I've been to both in Chicago. We're going to Oakland this year, so I'm assuming I'll have a fresh perspective on that in July. But yeah, I think when I went to, and I forget what it was called at the time when I was there, but when I went to New Comiskey.
That's what New Comiskey or Sox Park's what we call it.
Okay. When I went there, I think I probably went with low expectations because of everything you've heard. And I was, pleasantly surprised, but I, certainly wasn't blown away. And, I think, like you mentioned, they're a victim of timing in a lot of ways. But, it's an interesting thing to think of. Well, how would history be different if they had shut it down for 2 or 3 years, retooled it? Because we've seen what's happened with Fenway, obviously Wrigley in the same city. It's an interesting thought, but probably 10 years before people started thinking that way, really,
Yeah, the Red Sox were really lucky in that they got Larry Lucchino and Janet Marie Smith, the team behind Camden Yards, to oversee their 12-year renovation. They were ballpark lovers. They treasured it. I had some interviews with both of them. Larry, before he died recently, when they opened up Polar Park, which is where the Red Sox AAA facility is in Worcester, which is a great one if you haven't gotten up there yet. They were behind that as well. But I interviewed them, and they had this mantra of do no harm. We are custodians of this ballpark for a generation. It is for baseball fans and Bostonians forever. And they wanted all of their renovations to blend into the ballpark. And sure enough, I took a buddy of mine for opening day this year. He did not know what the park had looked like previously. He couldn't identify which parts were newer, which were older, because they all blend in. I would argue Wrigley is far less successful than that. I was just at Wrigley on Friday, and there you've got scoreboards that are analogous to having like a 90-inch TV in a dorm room. It just it's out of scale with the rest of the neighborhood, with the ballpark. The exterior elements feel like you're in, a suburban shopping mall, Hyatt, Marriott complex, something like that. It doesn't feel like you're in the city of Chicago. All that being said, White Sox fans would have taken any of those over what they got. Camden Yards is really interesting, and that two things happened. One is HOK, which is now known as Populous, the designer of almost every new stadium worldwide in the last 40 years. They had given a plan similar to what they gave to the Orioles for New Comiskey. And Reinsdorf rejected it in favor of the Royal Stadium-like ballpark, and a little bit like the 1976 version of Yankee Stadium in a way. On the flip side, Larry Lucchino got a physical model that looked like New Comiskey Park when he was first designing and working on Camden Yards. He literally physically tore the model apart because he didn't like it. He moved around things. He drove the architects crazy because it was really expensive to do those models. And they delayed it by a year. They opened in 92. They were supposed to open in 91, and obviously changed stadium history, ballpark history. And we have a completely different way that we look at ballparks now because of what they did in 92. And White Sox fans, and I did talk about this last week in Chicago, have to look at the 15 parks that came subsequently and just be jealous. Every single one, even the ones that aren't that successful, are better ballparks for one reason or another.
That's an interesting point, because I'm trying to think, and Ken, you might know, or Andrew might know, who was the last team before the White Sox to get a new ballpark? I mean, maybe the Yankees. I mean, if you want to count the Yankees,
I think it was Royal Stadium in 76.
Okay, so about that time frame. So you had like a 15-year gap there.
Yeah, I take that back. I'm wrong. Minnesota did it. I was thinking baseball only. Minnesota did it in 82.
Okay.
And there was never any discussion really of a dome. The White Sox flirted with suburban Addison, which is west of the city. They had plans for basically the same ballpark. They, of course, signed a letter of intent with St. Petersburg, and we're going to be playing in the Trop Dome, or what they called it at the time. I think it was called Thunderdome at the time. They actually printed up Florida White Sox T-shirts.
Jeez.
And it was only through some Chicago-style legislative maneuvering by Governor Thompson, who has since passed, but he was a Cub fan. But he repeatedly said he did not want to lose the White Sox on his watch. And he turned arms of a lot of downstate politicians who did not want a nickel of tax money going to Chicago for a ballpark. And there's all these rumors that they actually stopped the clock in the legislative session. It was supposed to end at midnight, and the final passage was supposedly, by all reports, not until about 12:06 p.m. or 12 a.m. And they got the money to stay, but they built something that was relatively cheap, $70 million in 1991, which comes out to about $350 million, I think, today, which is pretty low compared to every other stadium that's been built. Two other ballparks for that era have already been replaced, Texas and Atlanta. And the White Sox today are talking about replacing New Comiskey with a South Loop ballpark just south of the Sears Tower and the skyline, and the downtown skyline, which would rectify a lot of the errors of New Comiskey Park.
Well, as a DC resident, I can sympathize with or understand a team announcing that they're going to move and then at the last minute not moving, because that's what we had with the Capitals and the Wizards just earlier this year, where they announced they were going to move to Northern Virginia, and then that kind of fell through. DC came up with the money. These teams are never gone until they're gone, until they're playing in the other place. Yeah, it's funny. You talk about, I mean, I think, and I don't just say this because I live 25 minutes from it now, Camden Yards is great. It's the gold standard. It's just a great place to go watch a game, and I think a lot of things contribute to that. And I want to talk more about the White Sox specifically in a minute, but and Andrew, I'd want to hear your thoughts on this too. I almost feel like maybe somebody could try and do something different at this point, and maybe a few of them have, but it almost feels sometimes like everybody's just trying to be Camden Yards.
Arguably, the retro has become the new cookie cutter.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say, so the one of the stadiums and maybe if I went back, I'd feel differently, but I remember almost being a little disappointed when I went to San Diego, which I know a lot of people love the stadium, but kind of feeling like, the brick industrial works in Pittsburgh. It works in Baltimore. It works in Cleveland. I'm in San Diego. I kind of want to feel like I'm in San Diego, not outside of a factory. And, to me, I'm kind of like, did we need to copy Cam? And again, not to pick, I was only there once, but then it was almost like, these are all a lot nicer than being at Three River Stadium for a baseball game. But I kind of do miss a little bit of individuality that's not all just red brick. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I totally get that. That's why I really like Miami's stadium. Now, there are all kinds of problems, including the lies that were told to get that thing built.
Like we're going to continue to field the Major League Baseball team.
Yeah, I was there for opening game. And there was a lot of excitement then. Ozzie Guillen was the manager. He had come from the White Sox just a few years before, after the World Series. New uniforms, new name, new ballpark. And I really like the Miami one. It reflects the place, which is what I like. Mm. It's got the colors that feel sort of Miami style. I liked, and I'm going to curse Derek Jeter. I know that you guys may not approve of this.
Well, no, he didn't do a good job.
I do not like what he did. He got rid of things that were particularly Miami-like. The fish tank behind home, man, that was awesome.
Yeah,
the little kid in me loves like quirks like that. The home run sculpture in the outfield, absolutely loved it. It evoked the notion of what the original Bill Veeck monster was like in 1960 in the exploding scoreboard. And they used to have a Clevelander club in the outfield with a pool and bikini-clad women, which we've added, leaving that part aside, just the idea of having the pool at the ballpark felt Miami.
Yeah.
I like parks like that. Like, I think it reflects the architecture and the style of the place. And it's not a cookie cutter, but it's not retro. And a couple parks, I mean, DC, when they opened Nationals Park, they talked about it being a little bit different. I kind of feel like Nationals Park has a bit of a corporate office building look to the outside. And I don't know if it reflects DC. I would have loved to have seen some sort of neoclassical nods or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been here basically for the whole time since it opened, and they suffered from a couple of things. First of all, they opened in 2008, I want to say, which was just at the beginning of a recession, so it was bad. And that area that was supposed to be built up didn't get built up for several years. There was basically one bar in the whole area, and it was like not even a real bar. It was like an outdoor thing that was made out of like truck pallets.
I remember that.
And then
since then it's improved a lot.
It's improved. It's gotten better. The area has really built up. I think that the area building up has also been a double-edged sword because what am I trying to say here? Because that kind of adds to that corporate feel of it. Where now you used to be able to look out and see the Washington Monument. Now you look out and see a high-rise hotel. And then the third thing about that is they won in 2019, after sort of being one of the better teams of the 20 teens. They were in the playoffs 12, 14, 16, and 12, 14, 16, and 17. I want to say they were a good team through the whole 2000 teens. They finally win a championship and everybody was all ginned up. It's like, okay, we got this team that's going to go on their championship season. Attendance is going to go up. COVID hits. DC is still not, back to work back to the office in any real substantive way compared to what it was before. So they've had bad luck with that ballpark, sort of all across the board. I want to raise a couple other points. First of all, just as an aside, my favorite story about the fireworks exploding scoreboard at Comiskey Park is that whenever that opened, late 50s, early 60s, Casey Stengel was managing the Yankees, and to counter it, he had the Yankees hold up sparklers when they hit a home run.
I've seen that photo. That photo. Yeah,
that was Casey. My wife and I were, and our 18-month-old son were actually just at Miami Marlins, and we liked it a lot too. We thought it was a really cool place to watch a game. We were there on a Sunday afternoon against the Braves, and it was a really good. It was fun. It was against the Braves, so there was people from Georgia were down to watch the game.
Yeah.
So we really enjoyed the stadium, and I agree about Jeter. I don't know. I mean, whether it's Michael Jordan or Magic Johnson, or I'm sure you could think of some others. Like sometimes when these all-time greats try and run teams, they just don't have the patience or the tools to do it. Jeter, I think, kind of had a little bit of a stick up his butt about sort of this corporate mentality as a Yankee, and the Marlins were just never going to be the Yankees.
They should reflect Miami, and that's what those things did.
Exactly,
that's what I loved about it. By the way, that ballpark, I haven't been yet for a WBC game, but man, that's when it shines. When you get especially the Latin American teams coming through, and you get the music and the drums and everything else, that's really when that ballpark is amazing, when it's filled up. It's also great when the roof is open, because that, you can't do it too often, but when that roof is open, it gets a nice view of the skyline.
Yeah, it was open when we were there. We were in April.
Going back to Comiskey, New Comiskey, one of the big complaints about White Sox fans or baseball fans is that they oriented New Comiskey to the south, away from the Chicago skyline. And it's just a gorgeous view if you look the other way. It's a real good, expansive view of the skyline and the Sears Tower and the Hancock Building. And for soil reasons, really, if you look into soil reasons, that means dollars. You can always overcome soil issues. They oriented it towards kind of notorious housing projects, and they've since been torn down, but the view is really suboptimal at best. And they had right there, all they had to do was turn the ballpark the other way, and they had this gorgeous skyline view that would have been, maybe not exactly what Pittsburgh is, but something close. The new ballpark that they're discussing would be analogous to Pittsburgh or the Charlotte Knights, which is another great minor league ballpark with a good skyline view. If they do build this, then they fix that error a little bit. So that is something interesting. And the design that they're looking at, it doesn't feel like a retro design, but it feels more evocative of old Comiskey in the shape and the intimacy. And I think that's something that fans would like to get back. I mean, something that you can see in my book is really how distinctive Comiskey was. It gives you kind of a window back in time through color photographs, seeing kind of what it used to look like. I mean, thinking back to your shirt, I would have loved to have seen more color photographs of the Polo Grounds. There just aren't that many that were taken, given when it went down in 64. But that's something that I really tried to do, both with my blog, but also this book in particular, is give people a sense of time travel for those that were too young or never got to Chicago in time to see Comiskey before it was gone.
Yeah, and I think we should probably return to the 1990 season and the last year at the stadium, just to make sure we're doing justice to all of that.
I can always tangent on stadiums and ballparks. When you go to 2300, they always come up. New stories always pop in my head.
So can we.
Yeah. I've real quick on that. I've been to the site of the Polo Grounds and kind of walked it and the one stairwell that still exists there, which is, to be honest, bordering on not all that bright because it's not in a very good area. But I went in the middle of the afternoon. I kept it moving, but so that team as it goes on that year, I think it's kind of an example of so often you think, okay, what a magical moment this would be. It's the last year in this stadium. It's the big bad A's, who by then had won 2 straight pennants, who by then everybody was, I was tired of, basically, if you're not from that, from the Bay Area. And, they're managed, what was it, through like mid-August, they were still really into it and then fell out of it a little bit.
The White Sox had 8 days in first place. The last time they were in first place was July 7. They had a bit of an August swoon that sealed their fate.
Okay. And then by about September, it was pretty much
by the end of August, it was pretty much it was a done deal. The A's stuck a dagger into the hearts of White Sox fans by, at the trade deadline, picking up White Sox star Harold Baines, who no longer was on the White Sox at the time. But they picked him up, as well as Willie McGee, who was aging, but just another star. They were just so deep. Ironically, the Moneyball team at that point was so deep with stars. And, there were some series in that season that were just packed and felt like playoff games between the White Sox and the A's. And it really makes you wonder, just a few games here and there, how it could have been different. To add to it, they had a young Jack McDowell. They had Sammy Sosa. You forget, Sammy Sosa started with the White Sox, really the Rangers, but then the White Sox. He was a triples hitter and known for his defense in the outfield, not, running down long balls that were hard to get to. He could make the flashy play, but not the routine sometimes. But they had this core of young stars and real solid veterans like Carlton Fisk, who was helming a young pitching staff. And they pushed the A's as far as they could go. And I don't know whether the White Sox were juicing at the time, but it sure didn't look like it, given how skinny most
certainly
of those guys
not to
were.
The extent that,
No, I would invite people to take a look at my Sammy Sosa photo. I had one press pass for a day that year that I was able to get as a college photographer. And I have these photographs of Sammy Sosa just grabbing a drink of water or whatever in the dugout. And it is wild to see what he looked like at the time. He was so different looking than what he evolved into.
Page 67 of the book, if anybody is reading along at home. And you're absolutely right. He's just, it's almost like it's a slightly different skin tone. He's got the little bit of the pencil mustache, plus the White Sox uniform.
The hair too.
The hair, that's sort of the Jerry curl type hair.
Yeah.
Plus the White Sox uniforms are not what they would be even a couple of years later. They're still the reddish, with the cursive language on it. So you're right. It looks like a completely different human being. So
yeah, actually, to talk about the uniforms, I have a segment on the uniforms in the book. They debuted those new uniforms in the final season the final series at Old Comiskey Park. Oh, wow. They announced them in the late summer. There's a famous baseball card of Ozzie Guillen and Carlton Fisk, who were co-captains at the time, modeling those new uniforms in the new ballpark. And they debuted those. So it's wild when you see the last day of the history of the ballpark, the last night game, seeing those new uniforms, seeing the future, but still in the old ballpark. Those uniforms were based on the Oakland Raiders uniforms. I take it back, LA Raiders at the time. The silver and black was super popular. They were based in the 1959 pennant-winning White Sox uniforms, but a different color scheme, and just immediately took off. And then, within a couple of years, they were featured, in hip-hop world everywhere. And they still, to this day, for a team that is challenging the 62 Mets as one of the worst teams ever, still one of the most popular hats of any of the teams because of that sort of styling that debuted in the last weekend of Comiskey Park.
Yeah, it became very quickly synonymous with a lot of hip hop culture. And I remember maybe about 10 years ago, the movie that came out about the rap group NWA, there was a flashback that was set in like 1987. And one of the characters is wearing that hat. And it was one of the first, the first things on IMDb that was a goof was, it said he's portrayed in 1987 wearing the hat that didn't debut until 1990. But that's sort of, obviously the stadium is a much clearer delineation of, different eras.
The
uniform.
It was a blending.
Yeah.
The White Sox, along with New Era, put out a really cool documentary about it about a year or two ago that I reference in the book, in which they talked about, the interaction between the hip hop world and the White Sox uniform and how it really helped popularize that uniform, which is interesting because it's separated and divorced from the success of the team or the popularity of the team. I mean, the White Sox are a distant second in the city of Chicago, and a distant third in the state of Illinois if you look at the Cardinals as well. But at least as far as uniforms go, they're still one of the best sellers.
Do you know how many games you were at that season in 90?
I think I was at about 9 or 10.
Okay.
I brought my camera to almost every game. I took 3 days off of my summer job and just went there alone and photographed. I photographed the outside, the facade, the parking, that players' parking lot, the concourses, sort of behind the scenes, all the kind of wacky, people that populated the ballpark. Every ballpark has their special people. You guys had Freddie, and if you go all the way back to like Hilda at Ebbets Field. Well, the White Sox had Andy the Clown, and Andy the Clown was a controversial figure because, one, he was not really ever invited by the team, although they ended up paying him eventually. And two, he was loud. He would do this, "Come on, you White Sox," and it would go for like 20 seconds. And it would drive some people, including, I remember my girlfriend at the time, crazy. And the team told him, "All right, it's ending after we move to the new ballpark. You're not allowed to be a clown at the new ballpark." He showed up once with his red nose and his hat, I know, but not with the clown makeup. He had been at Comiskey Park for like 50 years, I think, 40 years. And that was, he was part of the parks. I, captured him, or like there was a shoe shine guy that was there for decades, right on the concourse, right by the dugout. And then, of course, the most important person in many White Sox fans' lives and many baseball and sports fans' lives is Nancy Faust, the legendary 41 season organist, who I also was thrilled that despite having a broken ankle came and performed on the organ last week at my event.
That's awesome. That's amazing.
She for those of people who don't know, she started in the 70s as the White Sox organist, and it was she, along with Harry Carey, who popularized singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" in the 7th inning stretch collectively as sort of like a collective serenade with an announcer. Harry Carey was with the White Sox for, I think it was 11 years before he went to the Cubs. A lot of people don't realize that. Again, that was a Reinsdorf casualty. When Reinsdorf came in, he wanted to corporatize the ballpark and the experience, and oddly, Harry did not fit in with that vision. But going back to Nancy,
I just have to stop you real quick on Carey. It is really amazing how much he's associated with the Cubs brand when you consider how much of his career he spent with their two biggest sort of rivals,
the Cardinals as well, for many years,
and then the White Sox. Go ahead. I just that was always something that
right. They were smart. They turned him into a mascot for the team, and it was a brilliant move, and something that White Sox fans are still jealous of. But
go ahead.
he had his thing with Nancy. Nancy's known for a couple things that everyone should realize. One is, and I invite people to look at. There's a great ESPN documentary. If you YouTube it, you can find it, about Nancy. She is the one that came up with the idea of "Na Na 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 Hey Hey Goodbye" being a sports anthem. It started in the 77 Southside Hitmen days, and they started playing, and the fans would sing along when the pitchers were being yanked or when a big home run was hit. And that was something that as a little kid was the coolest thing to me. Like, I didn't care about a win. I wanted to see the scoreboard go off and hear Nancy play "Na Na Na Na" and have everyone sing along. That was the thing that hooked me as a kid. And the other thing she did is she played a different song for every player, which is then eventually became what was called the walk-up song.
Mm-hmm.
And she would play things, pro White Sox, celebrating them. But she had a biting, sarcastic wit, still does, about visiting players. I remember one, Wade Boggs had his extramarital affair that was in the tabloids. He played Hall & Oates' Leave Me Alone, I'm a Family Man when he came to bat. Or Jose Canseco was dating Madonna, and she would play Material Girl for when he would come to bat.
I feel like
I can't recall what song she did, but she did something for George Brett's hemorrhoid surgery in the 80s. He had this bad hemorrhoid surgery that everyone knew about in the 1980
during the World
Series,
wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So subsequent years, he would come. I forgot what she played, but it was something kind of a little tawdry. I think there was a team that got caught in a cocaine scandal, so she would play the Coca-Cola Have a Coke and a Smile theme.
Jeez.
So he talks about that, like in this day of political correctness and Twitter, he probably would have gotten nailed by somebody back in the day. But she likes to say no one was paying attention, and she was the fabric of that ballpark, and continued on to the new ballpark until 2011. And it's still, a very young 74-ish, 75 years old now.
I think I wasn't there yet, but I think on the first night of the Sabre convention last year, I think, didn't she come and play the organ for people at the welcoming ceremony?
Yeah, she did. She played the organ, in some bejeweled dress, looking very classy. And she plays on minor league facilities now and then. She was supposed to have played the White Sox Cubs spring training game again. She did it last year and broke her ankle the night before.
Oh, geez.
Which was a real disappointment. I remember when she told me, she's like, I can't play your event. There's no way I'll make it. And 2 weeks ago, she called me and said, you can have someone bring my organ out of the car. I'll play.
That's great. That's incredible.
So I had my closest best friend. He was listed in the run of show as the organ roadie, along with his brother. So I don't know if that's a thing, but I write a lot in the book about Nancy Faust, not just because of me, but because everyone brings her up. Everyone talks about how she was part of that park. But I had a couple of real special experiences getting to know her. For the time, I thought it was going to be an article. And she invited me and my then probably 13-year-old son into their Phoenix home and played the organ for me in their donkey barn. She and her husband, Joe, own some donkeys, actually one since passed. And in the donkey barn, Joe goes to me like, hey, do you want to hear some music? I'm like, of course. I want to hear some music. Yeah. And he guided me in this little cinder block room, and she's got a Hammond organ there. And all of a sudden, minutes later, after she tunes it or do whatever you need to do to an organ, all of a sudden I hear like the old songs, Run Around Sue, she used to do for yanking pitchers as well. Inagata Davida, like all kinds of Bohemian Rhapsody. But then like Simon, my son, who's a modern kid, he wanted to hear Lady Gaga. Boom, out of nowhere, she just plays Lady Gaga songs by ear.
Wow.
And she does not read music, does it all by ear. The movie, and so I talk a lot about that in the afterword. This is a woman who is a legend in sports, but beyond that, is just the nicest human being, like almost comically nice. And I wrote about that in the afterword because I wanted those stories to be preserved and shared with baseball fans. It's while it's about the White Sox in a Chicago ballpark, it's really about a time and a place in sports that doesn't exist anymore. And, for me, I don't know about you guys, like my bookshelves are filled with old ballpark books of places that I did or didn't go to. In fact, I got one of Bossy Field. I don't know if you guys have been there in Southern Indiana at Evansville. I was there 2 days ago. That was one that was built about the same era. It was used in the movie A League of Their Own. Still being used for an Evansville minor league Frontier League team. But, those are the things I wanted to preserve for baseball fans, is so that, like, the ones that didn't get to see the Polo Grounds or the Ebbets Field days or Scheid Park, that it will give people for time to come an opportunity to see what it felt like, and it focuses us on this one special season. But really, the goal is to spark the nostalgia bone of people who know about that era and lived it, and to give a time travel to those people who didn't get there. And I hope that it's been successful in doing that. I think based on initial buzz, it seems like I've accomplished that goal at least.
And I think just real quick, I was just like, a lot of the pictures, I mean, obviously action shots are great. You see what a guy looked like in his uniform, or here's a picture of these two, in the outfield. But just, I noticed with pictures, especially of things like stadiums, you see something just kind of in the background, or a picture of a corridor, and you go,
yeah,
oh, wow, that's, look at that old cash register, or look at that old, whatever. It's like, I don't know why that resonates more than pictures of the stadium, but maybe it's just because I can place, like you said, a time and a place then.
The cars are great. I used to get so angry when a car would get in the way of my photograph. Like I would wait. Okay, let's get all the red light traffic to go through. But now I look back and I see those boxy cars that you saw in the late 90s. Or I have a few photos. There's still a brick road on actually it's Shields, not 35th Street. As late as 88 or 87, there was still a brick road right there. And like those things I really find cool. Or another really cool ballpark picture I took, I was hanging out of the players' parking lot. I got there really early, and you see the players drive in their Mercedes and whatnot, but they're like the quintessentially cool cars for the 80s. And then you see that. And then all of a sudden I see a checker cab, I think it was, pull up, and Rodney McRae pulls out with his White Sox big duffel bag. He'd just gotten called up from the minor leagues. And I don't know if you guys know what Rodney McRae's biggest claim to fame is, and I talk about it in the book. He is one of the most famous bloopers of all time. He was the guy that ran through the Portland Beavers outfield wall.
I thought that might be, yeah.
And unlike in the natural, survived. So he went through, and that happened at the time the Vancouver Canadians were the minor league team for the White Sox, I think double or triple A. And the Portland Beavers, it's now a soccer stadium for the Portland Timbers, but at the time was a great old minor league ballpark. And he went through that wall, and it was popularized later on in a bobblehead of him running through a wall, which I include a photo of that in the book because, seeing him, he only played 11 games for the White Sox, I think. But I got to see him come up. It was just like, you see that thing. It's like, what is it like to come up from the minors and you take a cab from the airport with your duffel bag and just show up at the ballpark? And back in those days, the parking lots were accessible to fans. Mm-hmm. Now they're in service tunnels. You never see the players the way that you used to, because then the parking lot was right there on 35th Shield behind a little wooden or a little brick fence. They would have to cross through the concourse to get to their clubhouse, both visitors and home clubhouses. And they would want, hear these stories like Babe Ruth went across the street to get a hot dog once during a doubleheader. It's at the old McCuddy's bar, or you hear these crazy stories about players like they were drinking for too long at McCuddy's and they had to get there. They didn't know they were playing. Those things you wouldn't have happen anymore. It's too corporatized. It's, you have a service level under every major stadium now, where all those things happen out of the eye of the fan. So it's fun to think back the way it used to be. And you only see it in a couple parks outside of the minors these days.
Before we let you go, I first of all, I want to I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, and this is mentioned both in the, I think you mentioned both of them in the book, and I believe they mentioned both of them in the documentary. Mm-hmm. Also, two Yankee related moments of the 90 White Sox. First of all, it's when Andy Hawkins pitches a no-hitter that is not a no-hitter because the Yankees give up 4 runs on walks and errors, and so he pitches an 8-inning no-hitter and loses the game. And then also 1990 is the year of the famed, I think this was actually at Yankee Stadium, not in Chicago, but 1990 is the year of the famed Carlton Fisk, Deion Sanders confrontation at home plate. So if you're a Yankee fan, like many of our listeners probably are, two, shall we say, embarrassing moments of the 90s Yankees.
I was really lucky, and I almost didn't make it because I got nabbed and went to Comiskey jail for about half an hour. I told the story last week. it was July 1st, which was Comiskey Park's birthday, and they had bat day. And I was 19 at the time, and then everyone's grabbing for the bats. And I probably knew that I was too old, but I went and grabbed for one. And then security grabs my arm and drags me to Comiskey jail, which I later found a photo, an image of. And we're talking, whatnot, and he realizes that I'm not like a hardened criminal, and he let me go. And I went and grabbed my seats on the first base side. It was a super windy, sunny day, one of those real high skies that you don't get often in Chicago. And it was super windy, and the White Sox could not get a hit, nor could the Yankees off of Greg Hibbard, nicknamed the Little Bulldog at the time. And I think they both had a no-hitter going until the fifth inning. And then in the bottom of the eighth, the White Sox got a walk-on, so it wasn't a perfect game. And then Jim Leyritz, I think they had two walks. Jim Leyritz lost a fly ball in right field in the sun, and 2 runs scored then. And then another ball was lost in the outfield, and another 2 runs score. So now all of a sudden, the White Sox are up 4-0. We get to the top of the ninth, and it's the most surreal feeling. Like, do we root for Andy Hawkins to get a no-hitter? I guess we do. And so he quickly takes care of the White Sox. The Yankees don't get a run, and it's over. And the White Sox win 4-0 and no hits. And Tom Seaver has an interview. Hawkins just despondent. I have photographs of all this in the book. Seaver was, recently retired. It was a former White Sox. He was doing the interviews at the time for post game. And one of the reporters talks about this in the documentary. Andy Hawkins was just in tears after that. He had this immortal moment, but he lost, and then lost that immortal status because the no fun people at MLB changed the rule after that season and wiped out a bunch of no hitters.
Yeah, they took a bunch away. You had to
pitch 9 complete no hit innings, and Hawkins only pitched 8. Later on that season, Melito Perez at Yankee Stadium, then on the White Sox, no hit the Yankees, but it was only like a 5 or a 6 inning rainout no hitter. So both of those are now struck from the record books as no hitters. But yeah, the Yankees and White Sox had a lot of interesting history. I mean, obviously the Yankees got the better of it for the last century, but they had some interesting history always together.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
There's actually a documentary that I'm 2/3 of the way through that's come out in the last couple of weeks on Peacock on the '90 Yankees. And
yeah, I saw that the commercial for that.
I've watched the first one. It's really good.
Well, is it called Bronx Zoo?
Most of it focuses
Bronx Zoo 90 or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Most of it focuses on Steinbrenner's suspension and Mel Hall dating a high schooler, but they do mention that they hit Andy Hawkins thing. So I've seen that in documentaries on from both sides in the last couple of weeks. But
if you have time, I have one quick story on that, the Dave Winfield thing. I had that press pass that I had mentioned. The reason I got it was the California Angels were in town. And at the time, Jim Abbott, future Yankee, was pitching for the Angels. And he was a Michigan alum where I went to college. So I said, listen, I want to get a photo of him and talk to him. Give me a press pass, please. And I got it. And I had this whole agenda planned for the day of what I wanted to photograph and do. But Dave Winfield came up to me early in the game. He had just been, was traded to the Angels as part of that whole controversy with Howard Spire on the gambling. Mm-hmm. And he was a real appreciator of baseball history. He said, can you please take a photograph of me when I had my last at bat at Old Comiskey? It was the last game of the series. When I bring up the lineup card. And we just were chatting the whole time. And at one point I go, where do you want me to send these to you? He's like, I don't even know the address of my new ballpark yet. Like, I don't know. You're going to have to look. This is before you could go to the internet. I'm sure he knew, the address for Yankee Stadium. He had been there for 10 years. But he's like, I don't even know the address. And just was a gentleman beyond belief. I was a 19-year-old at the time, and we chatted between innings. I think he was DHing that game. And I couldn't believe, this guy who was in this controversial story 2 months prior or 3 months prior, just was sitting there talking to this 19-year-old college photographer like we're buddies. and asking me to take photos of them. And it made that whole day really special. I missed probably some photos that I wanted to get, but got to really know Dave Winfield for that, entire 3-hour period. And it was a real treat to think back about that.
Yeah, that's an incredible story. And I've just from reading about him and seeing him, we were at the Andrew and I were at the Hall of Fame induction a couple years ago where he inducted Bud Fowler, the old 19th century black player. So you can tell he's just a guy who has an appreciation for the history of the game.
Absolutely.
Ken, real quick before we let you go, I believe I read either in your bio or in the book that you're working on another book, which seems interesting. Is that right? Did I get that right? And if so, tell us about it.
And also I want to mention before I forget, the book is available at lastcomiskeybook.com.
Okay.
Because it is filled with so many color photographs, it is an expensive book to produce, which means Amazon takes such a cut that you lose money. So lastcomiskeybook.com. I ultimately want to do a book with all of my stadiums. I'd like to do one about New York. I'd like to do one about Boston and DC and LA. I don't have the same depth, but they both have all those have a real rich history of stadiums. And I've been to a lot of interesting games. I think that would be something that doesn't really exist. You can't go to these cities and get like something with all the different stadiums, not just the baseball parks, but the arenas and college arenas and minor league, et cetera. So my next book that I want to do is about Chicago and the state of Illinois and, old Soldier Field, old Chicago Stadium, Wrigley Field pre-lights. I was actually there for the first night game.
Wow.
In 88, although it did get rained out and the Mets came in the next day for the true first night game, 88. And, the 85 Bears and Walter Payton. Not to mention there's a real rich history of minor league baseball and college sports in the state. And so I want to share those stories and those photographs and, start with Chicago, which would probably be the most depth, but then do that for other cities as well. So that, when tourists come to town to New York, they can get something that shows like all the sports venues of today and in the past. Obviously New York has such a rich history. So that's where I want to go next with this project and then continue to do my stories I do on the blog. I'm working on one about sports in Mexico City that I hope to get out in a few months. Just to give people a window of what it's like to travel to these places and experience games in a different culture and in a different place than maybe what they're used to.
Well, that sounds really cool. And if you're interested, we'd love to have you back whenever you bring that.
Love chatting this stuff.
So
absolutely.
So the book is Last Comiskey. You can buy it at give me the website again. Is it just lastcomiskeybook.com.
Yeah, you can also go to my Stadium Vagabond website, and there are links all over that place.
That's where I am at the moment. So yeah, and I am a supporter of folks buying books. Not that I don't use Amazon, but I'm a supporter of folks buying books from venues other than Amazon. So would encourage that. So Ken Smoller, thank you so much for doing this. This conversation was a lot of fun. Andrew and I thank you, and we thank our guests as always. And we'll be back before too long with something completely different, I'm sure. But until next time, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, Or who knows, maybe even write an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.